In this, our final lecture, we're going to look at the overthrow of apartheid and the ongoing struggles in South Africa, as well as the art that has emerged from those conditions. To begin with, we have to look at, of course, the most extraordinary man in South Africa, Nelson Mandela, who passed away just back in 2013. This is a photograph of Nelson Mandela on the day of his release from prison in 1990. And after 27 years in prison, he was a young activist who opposed apartheid, and he worked tirelessly to show how illegal and improper the laws of apartheid were. And so to silence him, he was sent out into this remote prison colony, and there he stayed. And it wasn't until 1990, when he got his release, he began to immediately negotiate the end of apartheid and complete democratic rule in South Africa. Through these laws, through these changes, one of the things that really inspired people tremendously was Nelson Mandela's ability to look past grievances and always focus on the future and the rebuilding of this country for the good of all. And he did a tremendous job toward that goal. Of course, after such a long period of oppression and segregation, it's a very difficult job that continues to need constant attention and work. But in 1993, a multiracial, multi-party transitional government was approved. And then in 1994, the elections were held, and Nelson Mandela was elected president, the representation of the African National Congress. With the election of Nelson Mandela, the question turned to how to deal with past crimes. For both the previous apartheid government and the ANC, the African National Congress, were both involved in extraordinary atrocities and human rights violations during this long struggle. And one of the things that they set up was called the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, headed by Desmond Tutu, who was the Cardinal of South Africa. Desmond Tutu is another extraordinary man of incredible character who led this commission to record the history. What they were afraid of is that they wouldn't have a real accounting of what exactly had happened. There was too much clouded in mystery and suspicion. And so to dispel the mystery and the suspicion, they made an extraordinary offer that anyone who came forward and confessed all of their crimes completely without any reservation, they would be exonerated completely from all past misdeeds. And this was a big deal. There were some terrible killers and some people who perpetrated some heinous acts during this time. And the stories began to unfold. Artists began to use this material to create their own work. Here's Sue Williamson, born 1941, Cold Turkey, Stories of Truth and Reconciliation from 1996. Here she's using photographs to document the evidence of missing persons who were detained, killed, or tortured during this long period. Other artists who now had the opportunity to create work in an uncensored environment began to re-examine the pain and the struggles they felt during this time. David Cocaine, made in South Africa, has done a series of drawings about these rabid township dogs. To him, these dogs traveled in packs were somehow apt metaphor for existence in the township. The Polly Street Arts Center was one of a few places where people in townships and people who were struggling to survive were able to go and find a venue for expressing their ideas in art. And so we see a number of drawings by David Cocaine about this kind of the violence and the perpetuation of that violence through these powerful images of animals destroying each other as a metaphor for the people destroying each other. Another artist who took up the image of dogs fighting is Legate. He did a number of other drawings of other animals with this dark, scratchy, sort of powerful, violent, and disturbing images. Dog, fight dog, eat dog, and this way in which the creatures seem to sort of stand on their legs like people. But again, the sort of stunted things and figures remind me very powerfully of what we spoke of Jane Alexander's work earlier with the kind of stunted and just misshapen forms. Probably one of the most famous artists to emerge in South Africa at this time is William Kentridge. And he is an extraordinary artist of incredible variety of talents. He is known as a printmaker, he's made as a painter, an animator, and a theater director. And so here is one of his examples of his printmaking. He calls this Caspirs full of love, which is a sort of boxed figure with these sort of heads crammed into it, faces, in this way in which they are sort of contained and brought. The Caspiri is this military vehicle that was developed by the South African military as a way of suppressing township riots. So they could go in a fully armored vehicle into the center of town and suppress uprisings, and then be able to arrest people, pull them out of the group, throw them in the van, and successfully escape. Here is William Kentridge's other work. I'll be sure to include a link to his movies in the lecture notes. History of the Main Complaint from 1996. And in these films, he's really doing a lot of self-portraits. His characters are derived. He is a white South African man, and he comes from a very privileged British family. But his father was a very important lawyer who fought against apartheid his whole life. And so as an artist, he feels, deeply moved and to record and address the nature of South African condition. Here he's taken up theater production, where he invokes the old character of Per Ubu and the Truth Commission. And it's one of the things about William Kentridge is, as a well-educated white artist, he feels quite comfortable quoting from and deriving his interest in ideas from European modernism. A lot of his sort of collages and other works sort of speak very powerfully to that. One huge project that William Kentridge was involved in just a few years ago was his Triumph and Laments, and this came out in April of 2016. He had this massive parade and mural along the Piazza Tevere, Rome, where on this river bank he had all these stencils made, and then they power washed away the grime along the river wall so that only these figures would stand out for a while. Eventually, the grime would return, and the images that he impressed, which are of the entire history of Rome in a kind of allegorical fashion. This vast parade was a theatrical tribute to Western civilization. Another black South African artist who began to use the material from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was Willie Bester. And here he chronicles the death of one of the famous activists for the African National Congress, Biko. And Biko was a very important man who had been captured by the secret police in South Africa and whisked off to a secret interrogation site where he was tortured until he died. The death of Biko was never reported. He disappeared and no one knew what had happened to him. It was only during the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when the men who perpetrated his capture and abduction and death came forward with their extraordinary story. And it's through that we now know something of the horror of apartheid. Willie Bester has done a number of these biographical thickly collaged paintings with objects from people who are in the South African experience, like we've looked at before, the sort of recycling of objects, this kind of using objects and the material life of people in a way that comments on what their lives are about. This is a migrant laborer who he befriended and painted and spoke with length, using a number of important images and icons from his life, including his own passbook, which he incorporated into the painting. The migrant laborer was terrified to give up his passbook, even though the passbook laws had been repealed. There so long were the laws of the land that if you were caught without a passbook, you would be summarily picked up and taken to the border and dropped off without trial, without any legal recourse. You could be literally kicked out of the country. Willie Bester has continued to make more elaborate installations now, moving away from painting and more into these kind of constructions, where he talks about the sort of absurdity, the mechanisms of society. Here in his work, The Apartheid Laboratory, with a private seat for a white person. Here's another strange and fascinating mechanism where he looks at the extraordinary problems of society and poverty through a mashup of agricultural machinery and traditional South African forms. Another very interesting Black South African artist who has commented on apartheid's end is Johannes Gogula. And like a lot of African artists, he has in some ways employed humor to address the problems of the social injustice. If you remember, we looked at Trigo Pula and his early commentary on modern art, the way he was willing to use sort of a satirical vein to address painful and disturbing elements. Johannes Gogula is a wood carver, and he carves these small wooden figures and paints them and arranges them in these little tableaus. Here we see a lion in gold fiercely attacking a black-skinned devil, while angels look on and videotape the action. And this is an interesting thing. This sort of action, these things don't just happen, but they can become recorded. The angels are there not as intercessors, but as a kind of marking the history, in observance for some future record, like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's record. In his other work here, this number of figures surrounding a funeral for apartheid in 1993. Again, the emotions, the grief, the joy, all the different expressions that people felt displayed in this grouping. Johannes Gogula has a bitter way of making fun of these conditions. Here he shows a black devil figure torturing a human being, dipping their head into a Bunsen burner fire, and the angel is there to photograph that, to videotape it. Of course, this is something really horrific, and the violence of it is unmistakable. And yet it's this small little diorama. It's this tiny, almost playful, absurd tableau. And the fact that the angel doesn't stop it, the angel can merely record what's going on, makes us feel this bitter sadness for the condition, the plight of those tortured. There's nothing we can do except witness this. And I find that really fascinating. And I find this a very powerful political statement. Powerful in a way that it's a very different kind of power. Unmistakably, Jane Alexander's life-size statues with their sort of twisted naturalism has got another kind of unmistakable power. But how different these two different approaches to expressing this idea of violence and expressing this idea of the injustice of things and the ways in which we as viewers are implicated in the violence. South Africa continues to struggle. After Nelson Mandela left office in 1999, Thabo Mbeki took over. And unfortunately, his reign has really brought an awful lot of ruin to South Africa. He has ruled much more like a dictator than a president. And he has instituted a number of policies which have denied the science of HIV. And because he has been so opposed to any kind of measures that would prevent HIV, the spread of HIV, this has made the matters extremely worse in South Africa. You can see from this map how dark is a region of South Africa under Thabo Mbeki. The influence of his rule is unmistakable. He just recently stepped down, and South Africans are beginning to express a sigh of relief that maybe, perhaps, this terrible time is slowly coming to an end. His ban on antiviral drugs in public hospitals responsible for the premature deaths of about 330,000 people and 365,000 people. That's a serious crime. And it's something we should think about is, if a political person in office makes a policy that is directly responsible for deaths for so many people, how should they be made accountable? How should they be punished for what they have done? We have no mechanism at present for this. The AIDS in Africa project has been one way to educate people about the plight of AIDS. Jane Solomon and her Bamboo Women's Group in 2002 invited people who were infected with AIDS to create a kind of body maps that recorded their history and their plight and their sufferings as a way of warning others about the dangers of HIV, but also as a testimony to their children and to their loved ones that their life is not without vain and that there is a feeling of trying to make the most of the time they have in this world. So these body maps record the patient's history, give something to their family so that they will know about them when they are gone. Here's some more of these body maps, and they're quite powerful. They're very personal and very evocative in the way they use images and colors and forms that suggest a body breaking apart and becoming one with the environment. These are more a kind of individual, personal explorations into the problem of HIV. One of the more serious problems is out in the countryside where people do not have literacy, how to communicate with these people, how to get ordinary villagers, people who are not inculcated into talking about even matters of sexuality, how to get them to address and deal with this very complex and very painful and embarrassing subject. So one way they found to address this is through a traditional means, which is the South African dolls. And in these dolls, figurines, they make them as a way for the people who are infected with HIV, as a way of kind of coming out and testifying and being and expressing their life, but also helping others understand what's going on with them. There are a number of different kinds of tableaus that are created, which talk about traditional ways in which femininity has been explored and trying to create new ways of discussing these issues. This idea of virginity testing was a way of kind of talking about the way in which women are subjected to these kinds of exams, as a way of kind of proving that they are not using or having sex with unprotected sex. The human tower is another way in which talking about the community and the need for support among the people who are infected with HIV. There are also these tableaus that convey the idea of orphans, children who have no parents, and this is a huge problem in Africa. One of the really fascinating pairings is these two figures here. The one on the left, which is a young woman who is wearing the beads and communicating in her way that she is a woman who has AIDS and is not a woman who is kind of outcast, bead work on. And then the woman on the right, who has all the status and honors of a woman who is fully married and is wearing this sense of belonging in the community, is a way of kind of talking about the disparity of these two statuses and a way of addressing the problems of HIV infection among women.